Hey guys, welcome back to Cash Game Mastery. In today's episode, we're going to do a little bit of a mix of reviewing hands and playing live, continuing our quest to become really proficient at no limit hold'em cash games. And the first spot I want to show you is actually the first hand that occurred when I was setting up the table. What I do is I jump into the table, I set it up, I then sit out while I organise everything else and play a hand, because I have to play one before I basically get into the big blind. So this one came up where I had sevens, and we went ahead and just peeled the big blind here. You can 3-bet here too, it's like the same EV, but usually you want to be calling this one frequency-wise, or at least that's the preachings of GTO anyway. So we decide to check here. Villain makes a small c-bet. Now, this small c-bet is a little bit suspicious, because while a small bet is fine on this flop, it's one of these flops that you're really not meant to have a high c-bet frequency on at all. So if I was to take a stab about how I think people are getting this wrong, I wouldn't say this is one of the boards that regs are like betting range with or anything like that. I think that's a little bit of a stretch and a little bit disrespectful to assert. But I do think that they could bet too frequently on this board. Nevertheless, I think they could maybe be guilty of just c-betting a bit liberally in this situation, because I do just face c-bets here way more than a solver would c-bet here. Like if I play the spot in a trainer against a solver, you know it's going to check back lots of the time. If you want to see me battling the trainer, you can check out how to become a GTO beast on this channel. There'll be more episodes of that coming soon as well. But yeah, the solver's going to check back a lot here because the 4 is very good for us. The 5 and the 4 together are very good for us. Basically, the big blind has the sort of monopoly on like the low, flimsy little cards, and this is a very good board for those hands, and it does devalue the nuttedness of overpairs and just doesn't hit any of the offsuit Broadway region, which is of course so prevalent in Button's range. What you can actually do here, just in theory terms, is you can raise a hand like sevens with a club very often. And the reason that you're allowed to make a play like this, and a lot of people don't do this, a lot of people just say, oh, I've got a pair, I call. And I think this is a big leak in the games of like micro stakes players, where actually your opponents are c-betting too often, reacting badly to raise, not 3-betting you on the flop as much as they should when you do raise them, letting you realize too much equity, all of these things. And this has a lot of merit to it when all of those exploitative things are the case. So firstly, this raise extracts value in the sense that when villain is betting here, they're going to have to call a lot of overcard combos, a lot of like floaty hands, lower pairs, 5x, etc. So clearly there is a ton of equity here for sevens, and when we raise with it and get called, we're by no means in terrible shape. We're doing okay, we're surviving, we're all right. So kind of a value element there. The other source of the value element is being able to like backdoor a straight, a flush, or make a boat. These are also extremely lucrative branches of the tree, and they shouldn't be underestimated. The other element here that we have going on is denial, and sevens is one of the lowest pocket pairs, overpairs to the board that we can have, apart from sixes, and therefore villain will very often have 2 overcards when they fold to our raise. This is really important because what people fold against you basically determines how useful it will be for you to extract that fold equity. If you were raising pocket aces here, and villain was only really folding cards that were dead that you actually wanted to hit the turn, like king queen, that wouldn't really be a very good thing. But when you're raising with sevens, the fold equity you get is extremely useful because villain always has like 1 overcard here and pretty much has 2 like the vast majority of the time. So extremely useful multi-purpose hybrid raise between value and denial. I don't like the term protection. I think it's a little bit too like we have to bet, we have to raise when we start talking about protection. It's going to overstate things. But yeah, you're meant to mix call and raise here. I decided to actually go ahead and raise just because I didn't have my RNG up, and I thought, you know what, if there's anything that's going on here, I think raise may actually be the best play for the reasons I mentioned. Villain calls. Now it's time to reassess. Like another reason why people don't love raising this flop is that they get a bit confused on turn cards like this. They're like, well, what do I do now? Like, how do I navigate? I'm lost. And being lost on the turn isn't a reason to avoid the flop spot that led to that turn. It's a reason to get better at cards, right? Just become a better poker player. What we need to do is recalibrate 2 things. One is the action sequence that led to this point. We raised the flop and villain called. Therefore, there's a condensing, strengthening effect in villain's range where there may not even be a condensing effect where villain gets moved towards the middle of their range. It may just be like a linear kind of effect where they have the top down because they're not 3-betting us with anything. But nevertheless, villain's range is going to strengthen considerably here, having called the flop raise, and that's going to reduce the equity of 2 sevens. Next up, a spade coming is going to further reduce the equity of 2 sevens because villain is going to have a lot of spade combos here, and they're going to have increased their equity. That's not a terrible thing for sevens specifically, but it does mean our equity is a bit lower than it would be on a turn like the 10 of diamonds, or the 10 of clubs in particular. The other thing to say is that some of Villain's hands actually contain a 10, although this is definitely one of the safer overcards for our range now, mainly because Villain will call Ace Queen, Ace King all day on the flop here, or pretty often at least, but will not call Jack 10 of diamonds, Jack 10 of hearts, King 10 of hearts, Ace 10 of hearts, Ace 10 with no club. Will not call hands like that super frequently. So the 10 is kind of a brick, but it's definitely a card that hits both players a little bit and does decrease the strength of 7s a bit. I think all of that taken together means that our hand is no longer okay to value bet here. I would not be playing any block bets here. You probably could block bet 7s if you wanted to build that into your inventory. You know, you could bet like third pot here. And when I say block bet, I don't mean like, oh, we have to stop Villain betting. We're gonna block him from betting. If you ever played Lemmings, remember the blocker ones that stopped other Lemmings from walking off the cliff, maybe showing my age here, but you know, I do that anyway. But yeah, Lemmings, quality game, shout out to Lemmings, other games are available. But this is definitely a hand that is just a little bit too bad to bet big, and I'm not building a block bet into my strategy here, so I am just gonna go ahead and check. 7s, Villain checks back. The 6 comes with the river. This is further degrading like the showdown value of exactly 2 7s, but we do have kind of useful blockers here to maybe bluff catch with. Checking seems like the normal play. Again, I think you could block bet here. I think GTO will be fine with a block on this node. The reason I chose not to make it is I think people are a bit hesitant to pay off block here. It's definitely an overfolded sort of situation. We know this from mass data, that actually if you block here, people do fold too much. They don't bluff catch enough like ace queen high or busted flush draw or something of that nature. To put this into perspective, if you block bet here, you only need 25% fold equity if you bet third pot here to break even. So Villain's MDF, minimum defense frequency, or actual GTO mathematical defense frequency, and in this spot they'll be one and the same thing, is going to be 75%. It's not always the case that Villain wants to meet MDF and defend that amount of the time, but in spots where ranges are a bit more equalized, like they are here, that is the case. And we talk about all of this, of course, in the Carrot Poker School. We get into this in particular in grade 2. So 7s here is definitely a hand I can block, but I actually chose to just check. There's a few reasons for this. One is just that I think that the block will be overfolded too, so it will just be like a little bit too loose. The other one is that I don't actually know that people do a great job of waiting until the river to bluff here. So I wouldn't be shocked if this was actually like a bit of an underbluff node and I could actually just exploitatively fold. The Villain actually checks back the ace deuce of spades here, which is a little bit interesting. I guess the idea is that I do have some air hands in my range that just whiffed here, but it's important to note that ace deuce of spades is very low down in Villain's range now, and there won't be a lot of combos in my range that this beats. Like, okay, there may be some like queen jack of clubs or something that's like continuing to give up on this node, so Villain does have some showdown value, but they also have a range advantage. And when you have a range advantage, it's not totally clear that hands like ace high are actually all going to be check downs here. I think it's important which ace high Villain has, because we could have something like ace 8, ace 7 here that's checking down, and ace deuce is going to lose to that on this texture with a 5 and a 6 being out, and no bigger cards than the 10. So it's not clear to me that ace deuce is actually a check here. I think it would be ordinarily after like more passive action, like check, 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 check. But after this sort of range filtering action of us raising and him calling, I think it's a little bit less clear. Anyway, time to jump into the pool, play a few more hands, generate some more interesting spots, and continue this quest to cash game mastery. Let's go. So I have an interesting spot here with 6-8. Already Villain is tagged blue, meaning weaker player. This is a hand against 3x in equilibrium that I think is like really break even. I have no doubt I'm winning with this call, because if it's break even in equilibrium, this call is going to be really good. This is the board on which people c-bet way too much. He does go for the big sizing here, which puts me off raise a little bit. I wonder if I still want to raise here, nevertheless, after a quick c-bet here. This is closer. Against a smaller c-bet, I would definitely raise here. I'm just trying to decide if like after this sizing, yeah, so this is going to be a bit more player dependent. The HUD I have here says 26-17. That is verging on the kind of passive side. I'm going to go ahead and fold here. I usually wouldn't fold a hand like 8-6 to 1-bet on the flop, and if I knew that that player was actually going ahead and just betting willy-nilly, like betting randomly for that sizing, I definitely wouldn't fold. But I do think that like the bigger bet there from a passive looking recreational can be a more overpair weighted range than normal, and so I'm just going to pass up on that fairly break-even bluff spot. Like that is definitely going to be like a mix of fold and raise and equilibrium, and I think they could possibly for that sizing just be a bit too overpair heavy. I do think for smaller c-bet sizes, people are just betting too often, and I would definitely raise. It's unclear. Maybe this is a raise anyway. Maybe like enough recreationals are just c-betting randomly there. And the idea of this series really is to look at lots of common spots. It's to leave no stone unturned, as I said in the first episode of it. And it's just to give you an insight into like exactly what the inner workings of my thought process are. What the inner workings are doing when I'm solving a spot. When I'm on stream, I may not say absolutely everything I'm thinking, but when I'm making this sort of series for you guys, I definitely want to just be really explicit. Fours, I'm going to call 100% of the time. I'm never going to be 3-betting this in the big blind against cutoff. It's just not a 3-bet situation. Against button, third pot, this is super close. Against cutoff, third pot, this is probably an easy fold. That's a little bit less than third pot. I still think it's an easy fold. The 4 of hearts is not a card I love having because it just means that I don't block as many of the flush runouts to villains backdoors, and it makes a very small difference. But yeah, underpair to 3 cards when you face a third pot c-bet, anywhere other than like really late position, you're going to be folding, and it depends also how connected the board is. So if you're on a board that's like, you know, 9, 8, 7 and you fade and you have like 3s, that's like a really terrible hand. Whereas if you have a board that's like ace, ace, 10 and you have 5s, you have to call that, at least against like button and stuff like that. 3s here is super close, but gonna go ahead and just pitch. This should be like a slightly microscopically losing 3-bet. We block a little bit of the hands that would always fold. We block pocket 3s, ace 3 suited, king 3 suited. These are hands that usually fold to 3-bets there. So not as good as like 5s, which is actually going to interfere a bit more with the continuance and 4-bet bluff range. So 5s is definitely preferable to 3s there. You can 3-bet 5s there, but not 3s. Although the EV swing will be quite small. But mastery is all about handling all of the spots that come up, not just looking at like really big pots and, you know, reveling in the glory when you win them and languishing in anguish when you lose them, but it's also about just the ins and outs of the game, just the humdrum everyday situations that really do make up the bread and butter of your win rate. Ace 7 here, I think this is close to the domain where I would never 3-bet, but not quite. I think ace 8, ace 9 suited here, I would always just call against cutoff, as they're a bit mediocre. Ace 7 is bad enough that I don't mind 3-bet bluffing with it. As a low frequency of the time. I have rolled that this time, so I'm going to go ahead and 3-bet. You'll note that my 3-bet out of position in the big blind is larger than it is in the small blind. This is simply a function of range polarization. On 10-5-3, my range is doing quite well here, but like not fantastically. And these are the kind of hands, these are the only kind of hands actually that I don't love going ahead and c-betting here. However, I think the texture of this board is so good for me that I can actually just go ahead and I think I'm still going to check this hand, but I can bet most of my range here. I think this is going to be like a 70-75% range c-bet, and the only hands I'm actually going to quote-unquote give up here with are going to be ones that... Actually, this one I probably can bet because it has like backdoor straight draws and stuff, but I don't have to. But the way I want to construct on this board in big blind is use big bets, usually bet with most things in my range, have quite a high checking frequency. I rolled an 84 here, which is a really passive number in my RNG, and have quite a high check fold frequency or check frequency with things with only 1 overcard and no backdoor, but other stuff like 2 overs, even without a backdoor, is going to c-bet really often and stuff like that. So when you are building your big blind range, you need to be a little bit more conscious that it's not as strong as a small blind range is on most flops, because it has some of these really bad polarized bluffing hands in it pre-flop that tend to whiff and do like atrociously. So your EV is a little bit lower. Some boards that are range bets in the small blind in a 3-bet pot are not going to be range bets in the big blind, and I think that's a good example of one of those boards. That said, I think my hand probably can still c-bet with some backdoor straight draw. It's certainly not completely hopeless. People get this kind of wrong where they think they need a certain standard of hand to be bluffing. It really depends on how well your range is doing. So in spots where your range is doing really well, you just don't have to be as concerned with like exactly what hand you have when you're bluffing flop. You can bet, for example, random jack high with 1 overcard on a board like 9 deuce deuce because it's a fantastic spot for your range and you just don't have to be selective there. This is a really easy fold. We're going to be quite dead to this squeeze range. The problem is that while this player is probably sort of capped and weaker, our hand just doesn't perform very well in this situation. If we're a bit deeper there, it's a little closer, but I think still like queen jack, jack 10 suited are going to be higher EV calls than queen 10 in that particular spot. One problem with queen 10 is that the cards you actually need to make straights and things like that are blocked heavily by your opponent's ranges. If you have a hand like 6-5, it can actually be like a bit more intriguing to flat because your straight making cards are quite unblocked by the ranges. When somebody 3-bets you, they're just going to have a lot more broadways. When someone cold calls, they'll have more broadways than normal. So it can be quite difficult to actually make straights. The other thing is that if you make a straight with queen 10, the board is like ace king jack or something like that, and then your opponent has like a set quite often and you're not as far ahead as you would be with a low straight. So much better to have, in some situations against 3-bets and 4-bets, it can be better to have the lower suited connectors in these situations. You'll see lower suited connectors actually flatting 4-bets more frequently than you'll see things like 10-9 suited, queen 10 suited, king 10 suited, like hands like this. I can mix call and 3-bet here. I don't actually have a big preference. I can do either. No problem building a flatting range out of the small blind. No problem with ace queen off being in that flatting range. I think against a large bet here, from what I believe is a regular, it's not great to have the Queen of Hearts. I think we're actually blocking more bluffs with this hand than normal, but we don't have any flush outs because we'd need like 3 more cards to make a flush. So I actually think this particular ace-queen combo is going to be a fold. I could be wrong about that. I definitely think if I have a club, I'm certainly continuing, but I think that combo against those positions, we just have to tighten up a little bit there. You also want to be really sentient of like which position of opener are you against. Are you against under the gun, who's going to have a much tighter range that's got higher overpair prevalence, or are you against like cutoff or button, who's going to be a bit wider? King Jack here is interesting, very close spot in equilibrium. I think what I can probably do in this spot is wield a very small 3-bet against this stack. I think villain will still have to fold to this on occasion. I think this creates a really awkward SPR for 4-betting, where they have to 4-bet to like 14 or something. Maybe I can even go a bit bigger and make it even more awkward actually. And then this is just going to be a really hard node to defend. I think this is like a professional short stacker or something. Maybe they just understand this spot better than I do and they're 4-betting me here and I just look like a fool. Yeah, I guess they can use the sizing and it's okay actually. But yeah, I figured this was going to be like a mix anyway and I thought I would do it for the sake of the video. I'm probably like slightly overfolding to this 4-bet, given that I have included this hand all the time in my 3-bet range, and maybe my opponent's aware of that. Probably not. Probably the situation is they just had one of their 4-bets and I run into it. I do think we need to be conscious about sizing against these shorter stacks. If this player opens, I'm going to be mixing call and 3-bet here. I'm going to be 3-betting this hand about half the time, calling the rest of the time. That's a solid strategy. They don't, so it's hypothetical. It's important to find your 3-bet bluffs from the blinds though. It's important to understand that in the big blind, you are playing a very polarized 3-bet strategy. You should be flatting pure with a lot of the mediocre hands in those spots. The question is it worth actually isolating here in this situation? We have a limp from, I guess this is actually a weaker player, another limp. I think it's best just to check ace-6 suited. I had this thing way back in the day when I wrote a book called The Grinder's Manual, which I wouldn't recommend these days. It's a little bit out of date now. 2015, before I became a GTO beast, you could say. Before I understood True EV, you could say. True EV disciples arise in chat. You guys love a bit of True EV, don't you? I think before those days, like, I still had a pretty good framework for like whether to isolate, and it was called the ISO triangle, and it was based on assessing your fold equity, your position, and your like how awesome your hand was, basically your frequent strength. I called it, like how often you will frequently have a strong hand on the flop. And it's a really cool metric actually. So here, while we have a hand that's got some frequent strength, like it sometimes does flop well, we're out of position with low fold equity, so we don't want to isolate. That's how we sort of take that archaic principle that still works today and apply it in the modern era. So if we had something like ace-10 suited there, ace-9 suited, I think we have enough frequent strength to make up for the lack of fold equity in the per position. It also matters whether one of the limpers is small blind, because you're going to have position against them, so that's important too. Going to be pure defending the Jack-10 off here against min, never going to be 3-betting with this one. Checking flop here, the Jack of Spades is going to elevate the frequency of raise that we have here against overbet. You can still play some raise, and I am going to mix some raise here. You don't want to play as much, so I would normally play about 50% raise with this, but I'm only going to play about 25 against the sizing, usually just defaulting to call with this hand. Overbet's fine on this flop, by the way. It's definitely a thing that can happen. I'm going to go ahead and give this guy the strong reg tag, just because most regs in this game, 200 zoom, at this time on a Friday morning are going to be good. And also people who overbet have generally put a bit more thought into playing unfamiliar strategies and constructing their ranges in ways that pose problems. They're probably, on balance, more of the intelligent breed of poker player. Villain checks. I think we have a mandatory bluff on this node. Despite the fact that we have the Jack of Spades, it doesn't really matter. Yes, it's a negative blocker to some extent, but then again, villain is going to bet a lot of their Jack of Spades on the turn as a bluff. Going to be rolling sizing here, using a lot of different ones. I don't actually think I have a ton of overbet here. So I'm going to mainly just be mixing between a big bet and the block. I've rolled kind of low, which means aggressive, so I'm going to big bet this time. We have quite a few like busted flush draws and gutters and stuff here. Obviously ace-9 is a hand that's never going to go anywhere to any sizing. But yeah, when we call flop there, we are going to gain a kind of a pair advantage. What I'm kind of doing in that spot is I'm going to be block betting a lot of my 8x pocket pair, bad 9x, and then like my good 9x, my 9-8 and stuff like that. My pocket 10s, pocket jacks, I'm going to be big betting. The reason I'm not going to be building an overbet there particularly is just that villain is going to have some combos of overpair still that check back that turn. And for that reason, I don't think we have enough nut advantage. Even with something like 10s, I don't think we're like quite in the overbet realm. 7-5-4, we can actually check back incredibly frequently. People are meant to build a donk bet range on this board because it's so fantastic for them, but they tend not to in reality. This will be a very easy check down. while the 9 wettens the board. It doesn't wetten it enough that this hand becomes anything but a call. So in GTO terms, this is not like a fantastic bluff catch to make. The thing is though, when I have an unknown player, I mean, maybe this is just a regular, but when I have a player like this I don't know, this does tend to be like quite an overbluffed spot, and we do have a bluff catcher. I'm going to go ahead and call here. I think it's just a spot that's bluffed way too often by pool, and while my blockers are not great in equilibrium because the jack is blocking bluffs and not really blocking much value, I think people are going to overbluff that spot. And sure enough, like ace-6 there, I don't think that hand is low enough down that it should be bluffing that run out. I could be wrong, but no, I don't think so. I think it's sort of king high and lower that villain should be bluffing with there. Ace-6 is going to have a tiny fraction of chop EV, and that should be enough for villain to take showdown in a spot where their range is not doing fantastic. I mean, they've still got quite a wide range from the big blind. They also check turn quite quickly there, which is just another sort of thing that suggests that they could be breaching the river with too much air and actually over bluffing. So calling with ace-jack there, you might feel a little bit squeamish about it, like you don't like it or whatever, it kind of ruffles your feathers a bit, but it's very often the best play, especially against people that you don't know are regulars. Like this player may well just be a reg. I just haven't seen enough of them to say for sure. And even if they are a reg, it's not out with the realms of possibility that they're overbluffing that spot. So the way I think about it is that recreational players are drastically overbluffing that spot. Regulars are probably a bit overbluffing that spot, and some of them will be a bit more balanced, but overall there's way more people who are overbluffing there than underbluffing there, so you just want to look up every bluff catcher until you know your opponent's really solid, at which point you want to start playing in more of a GTO based way. Covering your bases, you know, just making sure you're not exploitable. So yeah, you will see me argue for like exploitative call downs in spots like this where it's just hard for villain not to overbluff, given the amount of air combos they land on a node like that with. If they don't bluff turn enough, they also reach the river with too much air, which causes overbluffing. One of the main constituents of overbluffing, of villain bluffing too often, is landing on a node, landing at a decision point with a range that's a bit lopsided. Okay guys, that takes us to the end of this episode of Cash Game Masterclass. If you like this format, if you like this kind of coaching style, really slow, methodical, grindy format, do let us know in the comments. If you find it too slow, let us know about that as well. Happy to have your feedback. I don't want to make loads of content that you guys don't like. I do want to make lots more of content that you guys do like, so let us know what you think. It's really important for the channel to go in the direction that you guys are going to be most entertained by and educated by. We'll be back with more episodes soon. Don't forget to check out carrotcorner.com for all of your poker learning needs, and I will see you very soon here at Carrot Corner Poker Education. Bye for now.